Hey, what's up YouTube? Sky Badger here, and I'm back with a impromptu tips and tricks discussion about tanks video in Call of War 1942. So, as per you guys' requests, I'm gonna have a talk to you guys about the light, the medium, and the heavy tank. Now, each of these are surprisingly similar, but all have their own different advantages. So, what we're gonna do is I'm gonna start by talking about my personal preference, and then I'm going to talk about the pros and cons of each. So let's begin with my personal preference. Now I'm a simple guy and I just use light tanks. It's that easy. If we have a look in the research tab, you'll notice that light tanks you can get fairly early on. You can start researching them during day one, and they're pretty useful from the start of the game right through to the end. The reason I like tanks is because the way I play is very fast. I like speed and the ability to maneuver. Now, while the medium and the heavy tank are semi-fast, they're not as fast as the light. Although some people rather use armored cars for this sort of playstyle, I believe that light tanks, because they are still semi-effective against tanks, are the best unit for this. So that's my personal preference. Light tanks are my favorite. I use them a lot more, but in certain situations I do use medium and heavy. Medium tanks, obviously to get heavy tanks you need to research medium, so obviously if I have heavy tanks I have at least level 2 medium, and what I do with medium tanks is I use them basically to boost my forces. They're not quite as expensive as heavy tanks, but do more damage than light. So as the name suggests, they're a middle ground. And I often use chuck some medium tanks in to make the most of your stat-based damage efficiency. So that's really the only reason I use medium tanks. Heavy tanks, on the other hand, I use them a lot for defensive purposes. If we have a look at level 3 heavy tanks in defense, they are incredibly effective. You will probably even notice that if you have a look at it, defending and attacking against armor 13 and 11. If we have a look at the tank destroyer, which you think would be the best against tanks, you'd actually see that when it comes to attacking, the heavy tank is actually better. So for anti-tank roles, I generally don't build tank destroyers unless I have heaps of resources to throw around. I generally just stick to heavy tanks, as not only are they nearly as effective as tank destroyers, but they can do damage against armor. Okay, so in that part there, I basically kind of said all the pros and cons of each, but I'm gonna go over them anyway. So the pros of light tanks is you can research them at day one, and they'll are pretty effective through the rest of the game. They have a fairly small amount of resources. It doesn't cost much to build them and to run them. Production time is fairly small, but they are pretty weak. They only have 20 hit points. Now, the medium tank, on the other hand, has 25 hit points, but it is comparatively a lot stronger. If we have a look at the max levels, you'll see that the level 4 medium tank does 7 attack and 7 defense against both types. Oh, I was looking at the level 5. It's 8, isn't it? Yeah, it is 8. I thought something was on there for a second. Yeah, so level 5, which is the max level for the medium tank, does 8 and 8, and 1 against air, while the light tank only does 5 and 4, I believe. Yeah, 5 and 4, and 0.5 against air. So the medium tank is twice as good against armor, fairly better against infantry, and twice as good against air, and it also has that few more hit points. But if we compare the speed, the light tank can go 55 on planes, which is its top speed, while the medium tank can only go 50. So although there is only 5 km per hour difference, it is quite a fair bit. When you're rushing and you need speed, that can be the difference. So that's the difference between the two. Now obviously the medium tank requires a few more resources, takes another 8 hours to build, requires roughly 20 more food, and I think it was 100 more, no, 50 more oil. Yeah, 50 more oil to build. So it does come at a cost. You can easily afford to run more light tanks than medium. Now, if we have a look at heavies, they are fortresses. These, as it says in the description, heavy tanks are mobile fortresses. They have 45 hit points, which is 20 more than medium and 25 more than light. They are fairly slow. They go 20 k's slower than medium and 25 slower than light tanks. So they are a fair bit slower than the rest. But you'll notice that their effectiveness is definitely a lot better. Now at max level, level 3 heavy tanks, its attacking values are the same against infantry as the medium tank, but at defending it is a lot more effective, as it does 10 damage. Its defense against air is also 0.2 higher. Doesn't make much of a difference, but it is a difference, and it is quite a lot more effective against armor than the medium tank. So if we have a look at the resources as well, it is another 8-hour step up from medium tanks, so it takes a fair bit longer to build. The resources obviously cost a lot more, and upkeep is a lot higher. So yeah, that is the heavy tank. All tanks have a 50% bonus in planes, so they are obviously a lot more effective here. Obviously, if you had a heavy tank on a plane in a fortress, they are incredibly hard to beat. For instance, if you had a just honestly, heavy tanks, fortresses, planes, incredibly hard to take out. Especially if you have some SP, AA in there with them, they can be a real challenge to remove. So how do I use tanks? Now I've already said in the past, in the previous part of this video, that I only use light tanks. And I do have some experience with the rest, but my doctrine is pretty simple. Although this is just a game against AIs, and I'm at the moment I'm just doing this so I can get more resources, build more units to make more videos. Light tanks go forwards, covered by artillery from the ships, and this is how it works, is light tanks just have the speed so I can do this sort of stuff fast. In previous games, if we look back on my Let's Play series for example, light tanks, I used a lot of them initially during our conflict with Volga. I used them to outflank our enemy and get round them. Due to fuel cost though, I stopped using tanks for the main section of that Let's Play. Towards the end though, we started to build a lot more medium and heavy tanks because we had the fuel, and that paid off. When we went to war against Equatorial Gabon briefly, light tanks weren't as effective. Now they did help us recover land that we did lose fairly quickly, and that was good, but because we were going up against someone who used gold, the fact that we have the heavy tanks and the medium tanks already built meant that he had to pay a lot more to beat them, and that was really, really effective. So those are examples of how I've used tanks in the past. Now, like I said earlier on in this video, heavy tanks are best for defense. They are incredibly effective. They are pretty slow, so they're obviously not too good in attacks. But because they are slow, if you get them in a defensive position and you leave them there, enemy troops just run into it, they get destroyed. Also, tanks aren't too effective in cities, save for the heavy tank. Because the heavy tank has so many hit points, it is not quite as bad in cities as the others. Because it only loses 50% strength, it still does fairly well in cities. It's definitely not a unit you want to send in there, but to be honest, it's not too bad. If you want to send any armored unit into a city, it would be the heavy tank. Or you could just spam heaps of light tanks. I guess that would work too. Numbers are always pretty effective, but you send a light tank in, and it's going to do very little damage at all. 2.5 against infantry and 2 against armor. While a heavy tank, even with that minus 50%, will do attacking 4 against infantry. So, you know, they're not too bad there either. So because these are armored units, they do need to be paired with anti-air, and that is especially true with the heavy tank. Because it is slow, they are, you know, easy targets to hit. It does have, like I was saying before, it does have an okay-ish anti-air defense for an armored unit, but tactical bombers will rip them to shreds at 6.1. So, you know, that's how I look at it. They're very easy targets, and if I'm ever going up against heavy tanks, I always have my rockets ready to fire. I'll run, you know, 1 or 2 light tanks in, and then I'll just blitz it with rockets, and then just move on. Because that's how I play. I play a fast game. So, you know, once again, back with light tanks, that's what I like about them. Is depending on your play style, light tanks, their speed is very effective. But personally, it comes down to how you play. Some people will argue that the medium tank is better than the light tank, purely because it's only slightly slower but has more health and definitely can do more damage, while others opt for the heavy tank just because they like marching over, you know, huge amounts of land. Those players are normally the gold spammers who prefer the heavy tank because they can afford to just spam them. But light tanks are good in numbers and if you know how to use them. So that is my video on light, medium and heavy tanks. It was a little impromptu, haven't put much planning into this, but I hope it was still sufficient. So thank you for watching, see you next time.